My name is Kennedy. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've been described the same way: calm, capable, and low maintenance. I work in operations management for a mid-sized logistics firm, nothing flashy, nothing you'd see in a TV drama. I build systems, I solve problems before other people notice they exist. I keep things moving. If you met me at a dinner party, you might assume I'm the quiet one, the observer, the woman who smiles politely, asks thoughtful questions, and never interrupts. Most people read my silence as softness. Some mistake it for passivity. A few assume it means I don't notice what's happening around me. They're usually wrong. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about explosive arguments or dramatic walkouts. There were no shattered plates, no slammed doors. If anything, the most painful part of what happened is how subtle it was. I knew something was wrong when we started texting instead of talking in the same house. At first, it seemed harmless, convenient, even a quick message from the bedroom while I was in the kitchen. A question about dinner was sent through a screen instead of spoken down the hallway. But slowly, something shifted. Important conversations happened through screens, even when we were in rooms 10 steps apart. We were sharing a roof, a mortgage, a bed, but not words. And that distance didn't arrive all at once. It arrived in small cuts, tiny moments that didn't look serious enough to fight about. A joke at my expense that lingered a little too long. A decision was made without me that somehow still affected me. A look exchanged across a room that said, "It's easier if she just handles it." For a long time, I handled it. This story is about how invisibility can be assigned to you without your permission, about how being dependable can slowly turn into being dismissed, about what happens when the person everyone underestimates decides to stop explaining herself. I won't paint anyone here as a villain. Real life doesn't work like that. The people involved weren't monsters. They were ordinary, busy, self-absorbed in the way many adults are, and I played my part too. I allowed certain patterns to continue because peace felt more important than confrontation. Until it didn't. What changed wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it was internal, a recalibration, a quiet decision to observe instead of react, to document instead of argue, to move strategically instead of emotionally. By the time anyone realized something had shifted in me, it was already too late to reset the dynamic. This is a story about emotional distance, about power that doesn't announce itself, and about the difference between being silent and being silenced. And maybe, as you listen, you'll recognize pieces of your own life in it. Have you ever lived with someone and still felt like you were speaking through glass? To them, I was the steady one. The reasonable one? The one who didn't overreact? In our house, I was the default solution. If a bill needed to be clarified, I called. If something broke, I researched the fix. If plans needed organizing, I made them. I didn't complain about it, at least not out loud. Competence had always been my language of love. From the outside, we looked balanced. Two adults with careers, a shared calendar, shared responsibilities. Friends would comment on how easy we seemed, no dramatic fights, no public tension. We were a couple of other people who compared ourselves to when they wanted reassurance. What they didn't see was the subtle imbalance in how I was perceived. I was reliable but not consulted, capable but not prioritized, present but not truly engaged with. At gatherings, he told stories about us, funny anecdotes, light teasing about how I color-code everything or triple-check reservations. People laughed, I laughed too. It was harmless, technically, but there was always an undertone. I was the practical one, the predictable one, the safe background character in his more animated narrative. And over time, that narrative stuck. When decisions came up, vacations, financial moves, even small social plans, he would often float ideas to friends before mentioning them to me, not maliciously, just casually, as if my agreement were assumed, as if my role was execution, not collaboration. If I brought it up gently, he'd look genuinely confused. I knew you'd be fine with it. And that was the thing. I usually was fine with it. Or I told myself I was. In our home, my calm nature became shorthand for infinite tolerance. If I didn't raise my voice, it meant nothing was wrong. If I didn't object immediately, it meant I agreed. Silence was interpreted as consent. But my silence wasn't emptiness, it was processing. I noticed when he scrolled through his phone while I was mid-sentence. I noticed when my long workdays were met with a distracted, "That's good, babe," without eye contact. I noticed that when conflicts were postponed via text, even though we were separated by only drywall and a hallway, at first, I framed it as modern life. We were busy, tired, digitally saturated like everyone else. It felt dramatic to call it disrespect, so I didn't. To his friends, I was chill. To his family, I was low drama. To colleagues who saw us together at company events, I was supportive. No one would have described me as unhappy. And I wasn't exactly, I was minimized, not intentionally erased, just gradually reduced to a functional role. The house ran smoothly because of me. The logistics of our lives were seamless because of me, and when something works seamlessly, people stop examining it. They assume it will always be there. There was a night at a dinner party when someone asked him how he managed such a demanding job and still kept everything together at home. He laughed and said, "Oh, Kennedy handles all that. I'd be lost without her." Everyone smiled at me approvingly. I smiled back. But what lingered wasn't pride. It was a quiet realization being indispensable is not the same as being valued. In that moment, I understood how they saw me, not as fragile, not as weak, but as constant, as infrastructure, something sturdy, useful, expected. An infrastructure doesn't get asked how it feels. It only gets noticed when it fails. I had no intention of failing, but I was beginning to wonder what would happen if I stopped being so available. Not dramatically, not loudly, just enough to see who would notice. The first small cut didn't look like a cut at all. It happened on a Tuesday night. Nothing symbolic about it, no anniversary, no holiday, just a regular weekday after work. I had stayed late to finish a quarterly report. By the time I got home, it was almost 8. The house was quiet except for the low hum of the television upstairs. I remember feeling proud of myself. The presentation had gone well. My manager had hinted at a leadership expansion, more responsibility, more visibility. I climbed the stairs, rehearsing how I'd tell him. He was in the bedroom, propped up against the headboard, phone in hand. The blue light reflected off his glasses. He glanced up when I walked in. "Hey," he said, already looking back down. "Hey," I replied, setting my bag down. "You won't believe how today went." His thumbs kept moving. I waited a second, expecting the familiar pause where he'd lock his screen and give me his full attention. It didn't come. "I think they're expanding my role next quarter." I continued anyway. "It's not official, but..." My phone buzzed in my hand. A text from him. "Can you grab the package from the porch I forgot earlier?" I stared at the message, then at him. 10 steps away, same room. "You just texted me," I asked lightly. "Yeah, sorry," he said without looking up. "Didn't want to interrupt your story." The irony was almost elegant. I walked back downstairs and picked up the package. It wasn't heavy, it wasn't urgent, but something about the exchange lingered. When I came back up, he had switched to a group chat. I could see the flurry of notifications lighting up his screen. "You were saying?" he asked. I tried to find the thread of my own excitement again. It had already cooled. "It's fine," I said. "Just a long day." That was the moment, though. The first small fracture. Not because he texted me from across the room, but because my good news had been gently displaced by convenience. Because it felt easier to send a message than to engage. Because I adjusted my emotional volume to match his attention span. Later that night, lying in bed side by side, our shoulders barely touching, I heard the soft tap of his keyboard again. Another text. "Are we still doing dinner with Mark on Friday?" I turned my head. "You can just ask me." He smiled faintly. "I know, just habit." Habit! That word echoed longer than it should have. Habits form around what feels efficient, around what feels normal, and without either of us formally agreeing to it, we were building one communication filtered through screens. Even when proximity made it unnecessary, important conversations happened through screens, even when we were in rooms 10 steps apart. It was subtle, almost invisible. If I told anyone about it, they'd shrug. Everyone does that. Modern relationships. Don't overthink it. So I didn't argue. I didn't demand change. I told myself it was minor, harmless. But I started noticing a pattern. When discussions were easy, we spoke. When they required attention, we typed. When something could potentially become uncomfortable, it arrived as a notification instead of eye contact. And I began to wonder, was this a convenience or avoidance? That Tuesday night wasn't explosive. There were no raised voices, no accusations, just a quiet reordering of importance. And for the first time, I felt slightly replaceable, not unloved, just optional. The unsettling thing about subtle disrespect is that it doesn't arrive labeled as disrespect. It arrives as an inconvenience, as a distraction, as busyness. And if you are someone like me, someone who values peace, who understands pressure, who prides herself on emotional maturity, you become very good at rationalizing it. After that Tuesday, the texting didn't stop. If anything, it became more efficient. We would wake up in the same bed, roll in opposite directions, and check our phones before saying good morning. Sometimes, my first interaction with him each day was a message sent from 3 feet away. Coffee running late. Can you handle the call with the insurance company? There was nothing inherently cruel about any of it. On paper, it looked like coordination, partnership, shared logistics, but the emotional texture had shifted. When I spoke about my day, he would nod while scanning headlines. When he vented about work, I would set my phone down and face him fully. I didn't do it consciously at first, it was instinct. If someone I care about is speaking, I listen. Gradually, I noticed the imbalance. He responded to my sentences the way you respond to a podcast playing in the background, half present, absorbing keywords, but not nuance. One evening, I mentioned that I was considering applying for a certification program. It would require late-night study sessions for a few months. He didn't look up. That's cool. If you think you need it, if you think you need it. The phrasing sat strangely with me, as if my ambition were optional, as if growth required justification. I almost corrected him, almost said, it's not about need, it's about direction. But I didn't. Instead, I told myself he was tired. That tone is hard to interpret over fatigue, that I was being sensitive. That became my pattern reinterpret, soften, excuse. When friends came over, he would joke about how I can't relax unless everything's organized. They'd laugh and tell him he was lucky. I'd smile and refill drinks. I began doing something I hadn't done before, mentally recording moments. Not in a bitter way, not building a case, just cataloguing. The time he confirmed weekend plans without checking my calendar. The time he said, you don't mind, right after already committing us to something. The time he sighed audibly when I asked him to put his phone down during dinner. None of it was catastrophic. But repetition has weight, and repetition creates narrative. The narrative forming in our house was simple. Kennedy will adjust. Kennedy will understand. Kennedy will handle it. If I gently pointed something out, hey, can we talk about that face to face instead of texting, he'd respond kindly enough. Of course, you're right. And then, a week later, we'd be back to glowing screens in separate rooms. I began questioning myself more than him. Was I asking for too much presence? Was this just adulthood? Was this what stability looked like after the honeymoon phase faded? There's a quiet erosion that happens when your needs are repeatedly deprioritized, but never violently dismissed. It becomes harder to pinpoint the injury, harder to explain why you feel lonely while technically accompanied. One night, sitting on the couch beside him while we both scrolled in silence, I realized something unsettling. I was shrinking my expectations to match his attention. I stopped sharing small wins because they felt anticlimactic. I filtered my thoughts, saving only the most essential updates. I made myself easier to engage with. Low maintenance, low disruption, low demand. From the outside, we looked calm. Inside, I was adapting in ways he didn't notice. And every time I chose silence over friction, I told myself it was maturity. But somewhere deeper, I knew it was accommodation. And accommodation, repeated long enough, becomes self-erasure. It took me longer than I'd like to admit to recognize the role I'd been assigned. Not formally, not through any explicit conversation, but through repetition. In our relationship, I was the stabilizer, the calendar keeper, the bill payer, the emotional regulator. If something felt tense, I softened it. If something felt chaotic, I organized it. If something felt unclear, I clarified it. I wasn't asked to be those things. I simply became them. And once a role becomes convenient for everyone else, it becomes very difficult to step outside of it without being perceived as unreasonable. I remember one Sunday morning when his sister called in a panic about a family scheduling conflict. He handed me the phone mid-conversation. "Can you sort this out?" he said casually. "You're better at this stuff." Better at this stuff. By this stuff, he meant smoothing people, coordinating logistics, anticipating reactions, making sure no one felt uncomfortable. I handled the call, of course. I found a compromise. Everyone ended up satisfied. Afterward, he kissed my forehead like I'd done him a favor. "You're amazing," he said. I smiled. But what I felt wasn't appreciation, it was an expectation. I began noticing how often decisions were framed as foregone conclusions. He would say things like, "I told them we'd host," or "I said you'd probably be fine with it." Probably. My agreement was assumed because historically, I had given it. If I hesitated even briefly, there would be a flicker of surprise in his expression. Is that a problem? The question wasn't aggressive, it was genuinely puzzled. Because in his mind, I wasn't the person who created problems. I solved them. That was my role. At work, being that person elevated me. It earned promotions, respect, autonomy. At home, it made me invisible. No one questions the foundation of a house unless it cracks. And I had built myself into something unshakable, reliable, predictable, low friction. There was a night when we had friends over for dinner. I had cooked, cleaned, set the table, coordinated dietary restrictions, made sure the music was right, the lighting warm. Halfway through the evening, someone complimented the atmosphere. He grinned and said, "Kennedy runs a tight ship." It was meant as praise. But a ship isn't a person. It's a system. And systems are admired for efficiency, not emotion. As the night went on, I watched him animatedly recount stories, take up conversational space, and debate ideas. I watched myself refill glasses, clear plates, and maintain rhythm. I wasn't silenced. I simply wasn't centered. And somewhere in that quiet observation, a thought surfaced that startled me. If I stopped doing all of this, who would I be to them? Not the organizer, not the mediator, not the dependable background presence. Would I still be interesting? Still worthy of attention? Still chosen? Or had my value become conditional on my functionality? That realization didn't make me angry. It made me curious. Because roles can be assigned subtly, but they can also be declined. And for the first time, I began wondering what it would look like to step slightly out of mine, not dramatically, not destructively, just enough to see what would shift, just enough to test whether I was loved for who I was, or relied on for what I provided. The shift didn't happen during an argument. It didn't happen during a betrayal. It happened on a quiet Wednesday afternoon while I was sitting alone in my car. I had just left a meeting at work, one of those rare meetings where someone says something that lands deeper than intended. My director had been reviewing performance metrics, highlighting strengths across the team. When she got to me, she paused. "Kennedy is the reason this department doesn't collapse under pressure," she said calmly. "She anticipates problems before they surface. She doesn't just react, she designs outcomes." Designs outcomes. The phrase lingered. On the drive home, I replayed it, not out of vanity, but recognition. I design outcomes. I build systems intentionally. I don't move randomly. I study patterns, identify leverage, and adjust accordingly. And then a second realization followed quietly behind it. If I can design outcomes at work, why have I been passively accepting patterns at home? That night, nothing dramatic occurred. He was upstairs again, phone lit against the dim bedroom. I was at the kitchen counter, reviewing some documents. My phone buzzed. "Can we talk about the weekend plans?" I stared at the message. We were alone in the house. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I walked upstairs and stood in the doorway. He looked up, mildly surprised. "I'm right here," I said gently. He blinked, almost sheepish. "Yeah, I know. I just figured texting was easier." Easier? For who? I didn't argue. I didn't accuse. I simply sat at the edge of the bed and looked at him, not with frustration, but with clarity. That was the shift. For the first time, I stopped interpreting his behavior emotionally and started observing it structurally. Texting instead of speaking wasn't about technology. It was about comfort. It required less engagement, less vulnerability, less sustained attention. and my consistent accommodation had made it sustainable. That night, while he talked about rearranging Saturday to fit in a last-minute golf invitation, I listened carefully, not to his words, but to the dynamic underneath them. I told them we'd move dinner, he said casually. You don't mind, right? There it was again. Assumption disguised as courtesy. In the past, I would have explained why it disrupted my schedule. I would have negotiated, recalibrated, smoothed. This time, I simply asked, why did you confirm before asking me? He paused. I just didn't think it would be a big deal. I nodded slowly. That's the part I'm thinking about. He looked confused, not defensive, just unaccustomed to the tone. I didn't escalate. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't deliver a speech about emotional labor or digital disconnection. I just withdrew my automatic agreement. We'll talk about it, I said calmly. And then I stood up and went back downstairs. It was subtle, almost invisible. But internally, something had recalibrated. I realized I had been engaging in reactive peacekeeping, adjusting in real time to prevent friction, filling gaps before they became noticeable. That night, I made a quiet decision. I would stop filling the gaps, not to punish, not to manipulate, but to observe. If I stopped smoothing, who would stumble? If I stopped responding instantly, who would reach? If I stopped assuming responsibility for the emotional climate, what temperature would the room settle into? The shift wasn't anger, it was detachment. Not coldness, not indifference, just space. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't trying to preserve the dynamic. I was studying it. And once you begin studying something instead of participating blindly in it, you can't unsee the patterns. I had spent years being the foundation. Now, I was quietly stepping back to see if anyone noticed the weight I carried. Silence used to be my reflex. Now it has become my strategy. There's a difference. Before, I stayed quiet to keep the peace, to avoid being too much, to prevent small discomforts from becoming larger discussions. My silence was reactive and instinct to smooth edges before anyone felt them. After that Wednesday, my silence was intentional. I didn't announce the change. I didn't set rules or issue ultimatums. I simply stopped overfunctioning. When a text came from upstairs, "Can you check if we have milk?" I didn't immediately respond. I waited, not to be petty, just to see if he would walk downstairs and ask me directly. Sometimes he did. Sometimes he didn't. When he confirmed plans without consulting me and followed it with, "You're okay with that, right?" I stopped filling in the emotional reassurance. Instead of saying, "It's fine," automatically, I would respond with, "I'll need to look at my schedule." It was neutral, factual, but it disrupted the script. He began noticing small delays, not confrontational ones, just pauses where my immediate compliance used to be. One evening, he came home frustrated about work and launched into a long explanation while scrolling through his phone. I listened for a minute, then gently said, "If you want me to really hear this, can you put that down?" He hesitated. In the past, I would have let it slide. This time, I didn't. He placed the phone on the nightstand, face down. The room felt different, quieter, heavier. Presence requires effort. He wasn't used to offering it consistently. "You've been different lately," he said carefully. I didn't react defensively. "Different how?" "I don't know. Quieter." That almost made me smile. I wasn't quieter. I was simply no longer narrating my internal adjustments. In truth, I was more observant than ever. I noticed how often he defaulted to convenience over connection. I noticed how quickly he assumed I would handle something if it involved coordination. I noticed how surprised he seemed when I didn't preemptively solve small problems. One Saturday morning, he stood in the kitchen staring at the overflowing trash. "Didn't you say you were taking this out?" he asked. "No," I replied calmly. "I said it was full." He blinked, processing the distinction. For years, I had translated observation into action automatically. If I saw something needed doing, I did it. I didn't wait to be asked. I didn't assign it. Now, I was letting reality sit untouched for a moment. The house didn't collapse, but the dynamic shifted. He began to feel small inconveniences he had previously been insulated from. He began asking more direct questions instead of assuming outcomes. And occasionally, there was a subtle undercurrent of irritation in his tone confusion. Maybe, as if the system he'd grown accustomed to was glitching. What he didn't understand was that the system had always been me, and I was recalibrating. Silence, when chosen, has weight. It forces other people to fill space they didn't realize you were occupying. I wasn't withdrawing affection. I wasn't cold. I still laughed at jokes, still showed up to dinners, still contributed. But I was no longer compensating for every imbalance. If he texted from across the house about something non-urgent, I'd sometimes respond by walking into the room instead of typing back. If he said, "I thought you'd handle that," I would gently ask, "Why?" Not accusatory, just curious. Curiosity is disarming. It requires people to articulate assumptions they didn't know they were making. Over time, the pauses grew more noticeable. "You don't have to analyze everything," he said once, half joking. "I'm not analyzing," I replied softly. "I'm just paying attention." And that was the truth. For the first time in our relationship, I wasn't trying to manage perception. I wasn't trying to remain easy. I was allowing the natural consequences of shared responsibility to exist. He mistook my restraint for moodiness, for distance, for sensitivity. He didn't realize it was an assessment. And the assessment is quiet. What they never noticed is that while I appeared quieter, I was becoming more precise. Silence created space. And in that space, I began preparing. Not for a dramatic exit, not for a confrontation. I wasn't building a case against him. I was building clarity for myself. The first thing I did was observational, not emotional. I started documenting patterns not in a dramatic journal titled Reasons to Leave, but in neutral notes on my phone. Dates, situations, decisions made without consultation, conversations are rerouted through text instead of voice, financial assumptions, emotional deflections. When you write things down, something interesting happens. You remove ambiguity. You see frequency. You see rhythm. And our rhythm was imbalanced. I noticed that most logistical responsibilities were implicitly mine. Mortgage payments came from our joint account, but I was the one who tracked due dates, insurance renewals, tax preparation, holiday coordination, even remembering his mother's birthday. He would say, "You're just better at remembering stuff." And for years, I accepted that as a compliment. Now, I recognized it as a delegation without discussion. At work, I was careful about scope creep when responsibilities expand beyond agreed boundaries. I protected my role strategically. At home, I had allowed my role to expand indefinitely. So I began doing something subtle. I stopped preempting. If a bill was approaching its due date and he had equal access to the account, I didn't send reminders. If a social plan required confirmation and he had initiated it, I didn't follow up. I wasn't sabotaging anything. I was allowing shared responsibility to become visible. Simultaneously, I started strengthening parts of my life that had quietly shrunk. I reopened a separate savings account in my own name, not secretly, not deceptively, just intentionally. A financial boundary is not an act of betrayal, it's an act of autonomy. I scheduled a consultation about the certification program I'd mentioned weeks earlier, the one he had dismissed with, "If you think you need it." I enrolled. I rearranged my evenings to include study time. I stopped waiting for him to ask about it. If he noticed I was busier, he didn't comment much. Sometimes he'd ask, "Still doing that class thing?" "Yes," I'd reply. There was a faint tone of surprise, as if he hadn't expected sustained commitment. Another thing they never noticed, I stopped filling conversational silence. When we sat in the living room scrolling, I didn't initiate small talk to soften the quiet. I let it exist, and the silence became heavier for him than it was for me. He would eventually ask, "What's on your mind?" In the past, I would have offered reassurance. "Nothing. Just tired." Now, I answered honestly but calmly, "I'm thinking about how we communicate." That made him shift slightly in his seat. "Is something wrong?" "No," I'd say, "I'm just observing." Observation unsettles people more than accusation. It implies evaluation without emotional chaos. I also began repositioning socially. When friends reached out to coordinate group plans, I responded directly instead of waiting for him to manage it. I allowed myself to speak more at dinners, to finish stories without deferring to his punchlines. I didn't dominate, but I stopped shrinking. And I paid attention to reactions. No one protested, no one confronted me, but there was a subtle recalibration in the room when I occupied more space. A few raised eyebrows, a few longer glances. It confirmed something important: my previous invisibility had not been inherent. It had been habitual. Perhaps the most significant preparation happened internally. I asked myself difficult questions without dramatizing them. If nothing changes, can I live like this long term? Is this a season or a structure? Am I reacting to ego or to erosion? I removed romance from the analysis. I looked at behavior patterns, not isolated moments, and a quiet truth began forming. The issue wasn't texting. It wasn't chores. It wasn't even noticed. It was asymmetry. Effort was not distributed equally. Emotional labor was not mutually acknowledged. Assumptions favored his convenience. And because I rarely protested, the imbalance looked like harmony. They never noticed the data I was gathering. They never noticed the way I was emotionally detaching from outcomes, the way I stopped needing him to validate my experiences. They never noticed that I was designing options, not ultimatums, options, because once you see a system clearly, you realize you don't have to fight it. You can step outside of it, and stepping outside is much quieter than breaking it. The reveal wasn't dramatic. There was no hidden message thread, no shocking discovery, no betrayal that would justify an explosive reaction. The clarity I found was quieter than that. It happened on an ordinary evening while I was reviewing our financial dashboard. Numbers have always steadied me. They don't gaslight you. They don't reinterpret themselves based on mood. They show patterns without emotion. As I scanned transactions from the past year, something became undeniably clear while we both contributed financially. I carried the cognitive management of our entire household economy. Subscriptions were in my name. Renewal reminders went to my email. Investment tracking, my spreadsheets. Even his discretionary spending often flowed through systems I had organized. He had access, but I had control. Not because I demanded it, because I absorbed it. And then the realization crystallized. If I stepped back fully, not just from chores or conversation, but from structural responsibility, the stability of our shared life would wobble. Not collapse, but wobble. That wasn't leverage in a manipulative sense. It was leverage in an awareness sense. I wasn't dependent in the way I'd unconsciously feared. I was foundational. And foundations have options. I began mapping scenarios calmly, like I would for a project risk assessment. Scenario 1. I continue as we are. I manage, adjust, and accommodate. The emotional asymmetry persists, but life remains outwardly stable. Scenario 2. I demand change through confrontation, high emotional volatility, temporary improvements, possible regression. Scenario 3. I shift structurally, financial independence, emotional independence, clear boundaries, no dramatics. The third scenario felt the most aligned with who I am. Not explosive, irreversible. Around the same time, I completed the first phase of my certification program. The additional credential increased my earning potential significantly. I didn't announce the salary projections, I simply noted them privately. Another private reveal surfaced when I reviewed our communication patterns over months of saved messages. When conversations were important finances, family obligations, conflict, they were often initiated by me. When he initiated, it was usually logistical or convenient. The emotional maintenance of the relationship had been mine. And here's the part that shifted everything. I realized I was no longer hurt. I was informed. Hurt seeks reassurance. Information seeks a decision. One night, he texted from downstairs while I was in the study. Are you coming to bed? I stared at the screen. 10 steps apart? I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I walked into the hallway and paused. The house was quiet, soft television glow flickering under the living room doorway. For the first time, I didn't feel lonely. I felt detached, not cold, just separate. And in that separation, there was strength. I walked downstairs, not because of the text, but because I chose to. He looked up, slightly surprised again. You didn't answer, he said lightly. I didn't need to, I replied. There was no tension in my voice, just calm. He studied me for a second longer than usual. What's going on with you lately? That question used to make me scramble to reassure him. Now, I answered honestly. I'm evaluating. Evaluating what? Os. He laughed softly, uncertain whether I was serious. I didn't know there was a test. There isn't, I said, just observation. He didn't press further, and that told me something important too. If he sensed distance, but didn't feel urgency to address it deeply. That meant the imbalance was more comfortable for him than the uncertainty was uncomfortable. The private reveal wasn't about catching him doing something wrong. It was about recognizing that I no longer needed him to change in order for me to act. I had leverage. Financially, emotionally, strategically. And leverage doesn't require an announcement. It requires a decision. By that point, I wasn't angry. I wasn't reactive. I was clear. And clarity is the quietest form of power. Clarity creates a strange kind of calm. Once I understood the structure of our dynamic, how responsibility pooled toward me, how convenience tilted toward him, how communication retreated behind screens, I stopped feeling confused. What remained was choice. And choice is heavier than confusion. For weeks, I lived in quiet evaluation mode. Nothing outward changed dramatically. We still had dinner together, still attended social gatherings, still shared a bed. If someone had looked at us from the outside, they would have seen continuity. But internally, I was reviewing options with precision. Option 1 was the most socially acceptable: initiate a serious conversation. Outline my concerns, request behavioral change, and possibly suggest couples counseling. It would signal effort. It would demonstrate commitment. But when I visualized that path, I felt tired. Not because communication is wrong, because I had already communicated in smaller ways for years, gently, calmly, repeatedly. Can we talk face to face? Can you ask me before confirming? I need you present when I'm speaking. Each time, he agreed. Each time, the pattern resurfaced. Option 2 was endurance. Accept that this is how modern relationships evolve. Prioritize stability over fulfillment, shrink expectations, maintain the house, maintain the image, keep things easy. That option felt safe and deeply dishonest. Option 3 was structural independence without drama. Not a fight, not a threat, a repositioning. I began asking myself a different question. Not can this improve, but if it never improves, am I willing to stay? The answer arrived quietly. No, it wasn't an angry no. It wasn't a wounded no. It was a grounded, rational number. I didn't want to live in a relationship where emotional presence was optional, where important conversations happened through screens, even when we were in rooms 10 steps apart, where my competence made me convenient but not deeply engaged. Once I admitted that truth to myself, the rest became logistical. One evening, we were sitting on opposite ends of the couch, both on our phones. The television was playing something neither of us was really watching. My phone buzzed. We should plan that vacation soon. I looked up at him. He didn't. That was the moment I understood something irreversible. We were planning future experiences while avoiding present intimacy. I set my phone down. I'm not sure I want to plan a vacation right now, I said evenly. He glanced over, surprised. Why? Because I'm not sure we're aligned. That caught his attention. Aligned how? I held his gaze, calm. I don't feel connected to you. Silence. Real silence this time. Not digital, not distracted. He shifted uncomfortably. That's a little dramatic, don't you think? There it was. Minimization. In that instant, I saw our entire dynamic condensed into one response. My vulnerability was framed as an exaggeration. My clarity reframed as a mood. And instead of defending my statement, I felt something settle inside me. This is the structure, I thought, and I choose not to live inside it anymore. I didn't argue. I didn't escalate. I'm not being dramatic, I said quietly. I'm being honest. He looked unsettled, not furious, not remorseful, just destabilized. Because this wasn't the role I usually played. That night, lying in bed, I made the decision. Not impulsively, not emotionally, I would leave. Not tomorrow, not explosively, but deliberately. I would untangle finances properly, review housing options, protect both of us from chaos. I wouldn't threaten, I would execute. Because once you see that a dynamic is built on asymmetry, you have two options: accept it or exit it. And I had reached the point where acceptance would cost me more than departure. The decision didn't feel loud. It felt final. Once the decision was made, everything became methodical. There's something steadying about logistics. Emotions can fluctuate, plans cannot. So I focused on structure. The first step was financial separation. Not dramatic, not secretive, just deliberate. I scheduled a meeting with a financial advisor under the pretense of long-term planning. Technically, that wasn't a lie. I was planning long term, just not in the way he assumed. I reviewed our joint accounts, automatic payments, and shared subscriptions. I created a clean, detailed breakdown of what was communal and what was individually sustainable. I calculated my independent monthly budget down to the smallest line item. Numbers didn't intimidate me. They clarified freedom. Next, I began researching housing options, not impulsively scrolling listings at midnight, but carefully evaluating neighborhoods, commute times, and rental agreements. I saved properties to a private folder. I ran cost comparisons. All of this happened quietly, at home. Nothing outwardly dramatic shifted. We still texted from separate rooms. We still shared grocery lists through an app instead of conversation. The surface continuity actually helped. He had no reason to suspect structural change because there was no emotional explosion to signal it. One evening, he asked, "You've been working late a lot. Everything okay?" "Yes," I said truthfully. "I'm focused." That word felt accurate in more ways than one. I also consulted a lawyer not because we were married with complex entanglements, but because shared property requires precision. I wanted clarity on timelines, notice periods, and asset division, not to win, not to punish, to avoid chaos. The lawyer's office was quiet and impersonal. She asked measured questions. I answered calmly. There were no tears, no dramatics, just logistics. When she finished outlining my options, she looked at me thoughtfully. "You're very composed," she said. "I've had time to think," I replied. Back at home, I began shifting small routines. I transferred my direct deposit fully into my personal account. I reorganized digital passwords. I removed my name from a few non-essential joint services. Nothing disruptive. Nothing that would immediately trigger an alarm. I was untangling threads before pulling the fabric apart. He remained largely unaware. If anything, he seemed slightly unsettled by my increased independence, but couldn't articulate why. I no longer asked his opinion about minor decisions. I didn't seek validation about my certification progress. I made purchases without over-explaining. One night, he texted from downstairs again. "Are we good? You've seemed distant." I read the message carefully. This was the closest he had come to naming the shift. Instead of replying immediately, I walked downstairs. He was on the couch, phone in hand. "I'm not distant," I said calmly. "I'm clear." "Clear about what?" "About what I need." He frowned slightly. And I'm deciding. That unsettled him more than an accusation would have. Deciding what he asked, I held his gaze, steady. "About my future." I didn't elaborate. I didn't threaten. I let ambiguity sit. Ambiguity is uncomfortable when you're used to certainty. Over the next few weeks, I finalized the lease on a small, modern apartment closer to my office. I chose it not because it was dramatic or symbolic, but because it was efficient, bright, natural light, clean lines, walking distance to a cafe I liked. It felt intentional. On move-in day, I didn't schedule a dramatic departure. I arranged for movers while he was at work. I packed only what was mine clothes, books, personal documents, and a few pieces of art. I left shared items untouched. When you move in silence, the loudest part is the absence you leave behind. By the time he realized something structural had shifted, the paperwork was signed, and I was no longer deciding. I had acted. He noticed in fragments, not all at once. The first consequence wasn't emotional, it was practical. I moved on a Thursday. By Friday afternoon, he called. Not texted. Called. I let it ring once before answering. "Hey," I said evenly. "What's going on?" His voice was tight, not angry, disoriented. I moved into the apartment. I replied, "You moved." A pause, like temporarily. "No." Silence on the other end. Real silence. The kind that stretches because there's no script prepared for it. "You didn't tell me," he said finally. "I did." I answered calmly. "I told you I was deciding about my future. That's not the same as saying you were leaving." I absorbed that. He wasn't wrong. I hadn't staged a dramatic announcement. I hadn't delivered a speech. But I had been clear. "I've been telling you something was misaligned for a long time," I said quietly. "You just didn't think it would require action." He exhaled sharply. "This feels extreme." That word again. Extreme. I could hear the confusion more than the accusation. In his mind, nothing catastrophic had happened. No infidelity, no explosive fights. Just gradual drift. And drift rarely feels urgent until one person decides to stop floating. Over the next few days, the consequences revealed themselves in small inconveniences. He called, asking where the insurance documents were saved. "They're in the shared drive," I said, under household. A longer pause. "I can't find them." "Look in the subfolder labeled policies." More silence, the faint clicking of a mouse. Oh, he hadn't needed to know the structure before. I had always navigated it for him. Another call. "Did we pay the property tax installment already?" "It's scheduled," I replied. "You have access to the account." A third call. "When's garbage pickup?" "It's on the city website." None of these questions was unreasonable, but their frequency revealed something. He was encountering the weight I had quietly carried. Friends began reaching out too. "Are you two okay?" one asked carefully. "We're adjusting," I replied. I didn't vent. I didn't recruit allies. I didn't narrate grievances. This wasn't about public validation. It was about private alignment. One evening, he asked to meet. We chose a neutral cafe halfway between the house and my new apartment. When he walked in, he looked unsettled, not devastated, not furious, just disoriented. "I didn't think it was that bad," he said, sitting across from me. "I know," I replied. "That's what's confusing." I nodded. "That's the point." He studied me carefully, as if trying to locate the version of me who would have softened this moment. "I would have tried harder," he said. "You had years to try," I answered gently. "You just didn't feel urgency." He leaned back, absorbing that. Consequences aren't always loud. Sometimes they're administrative, emotional recalculations, practical burdens redistributed. The house felt different to him now, quieter in a way that wasn't peaceful. Meals require planning, bills required tracking, silence required confronting. He began texting more frequently, not logistics, but questions. "Can we talk? Are you sure about this? What would it take to fix it?" I responded thoughtfully, but not reactively. The consequences had begun. Not explosive, not chaotic, just undeniable. For the first time, he was feeling absence instead of convenience. And absence speaks more clearly than any argument I could have delivered. The shift from confusion to panic was subtle, but I recognized it immediately. At first, his messages were measured, curious, controlled. Then they became longer. "I've been thinking a lot. I didn't realize you felt that disconnected. We can go to counseling. I'll do whatever it takes." Whatever it takes is a powerful phrase. It sounds decisive, but it usually arrives late. We met again, this time back at the house. I agreed because I didn't want avoidance to define the ending. I wanted clarity to define it. Walking through the front door felt strange, familiar, but lighter, as if I were visiting a place I used to live rather than returning home. He had cleaned, not in the surface way of preparing for guests, but thoroughly. Counters empty, floors vacuumed, the trash is gone. Small signs of effort. "I've been reading about emotional presence," he said, almost awkwardly, as we sat at the kitchen table, about how screens create distance. I didn't realize how much I was doing that. I listened, not skeptically, just neutrally. "I thought you were just steady," he continued. "I didn't think you were unhappy. That's because I wasn't loud about it." I replied. He leaned forward. "Why didn't you tell me it was this serious?" I held his gaze. "I did. In small ways, repeatedly." He ran a hand through his hair. Frustration creeping in, not at me, but at the realization. "I thought we were fine," he said quietly. And that was the tragedy of it. He wasn't malicious. He wasn't cruel. He was comfortable. And comfort had cost us connection. "I'm willing to change," he said. "I can put my phone away. I can check in more. I can ask before making decisions." I believed him. That's what made it harder, because his willingness was real. But my clarity was also real. "The problem isn't that you can change," I said calmly. "It's that you only felt urgency when I left." Silence settled between us. "If I had stayed," I continued softly, "would you have changed?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. That silence told the truth. He reached across the table, not dramatically, just instinctively. I didn't pull away, but I didn't lean in either. "I don't want to lose you over something we can fix," he said. "This isn't about losing," I replied. "It's about alignment." He looked at me, the way people look at something slipping through their fingers, not because it was ripped away, but because they hadn't realized they needed to hold it tighter. Are you sure? He asked, voice quieter now. Yes. The word landed gently but firmly. Not angry, not bitter, certain. There's a moment in every irreversible decision when both people understand that effort has shifted from prevention to regret. We were in that moment. He offered therapy, scheduled date nights, communication rules, shared calendars, phone-free evenings. All good ideas, all valuable, all too late to be foundational, because the issue wasn't tactics, it was an asymmetry sustained for years. And once you've detached from needing someone to meet you halfway, you can't force yourself to reattach just because they finally step forward. When I left that night, there were no slammed doors, no dramatic speeches, just quiet acceptance. He stood in the doorway as I walked to my car. I didn't think you'd actually go, he said. I paused. I didn't think you'd notice only when I did. And then I drove away. Some things can be repaired, but some things once seen clearly can't be unseen, and clarity doesn't reverse itself to accommodate panic. The final confrontation didn't feel like a confrontation at all. It felt like an exit interview. We met one last time to finalize practical details, transferring utilities fully into his name, dividing remaining shared furniture, and confirming the timeline for refinancing the house. It was administrative, almost clinical. We sat across from each other at the same dining table where we had once hosted friends. The lighting was the same. The chairs hadn't moved, but the dynamic had. There was no anger in the room, no raised voices, just a quiet understanding that we were closing something carefully rather than tearing it apart. I've been replaying everything, he said at one point, trying to figure out where I missed it. You didn't miss it, I replied calmly. You minimized it. He nodded slowly. That's fair. There was something different in him now, less defensive, more reflective. The panic had softened into introspection. I never meant to make you feel invisible, he said. I know, I answered, and I meant that. Intent and impact are not the same. He hadn't intended to sideline me emotionally. He hadn't consciously decided that texting from the next room mattered less than eye contact. But intention doesn't erase erosion. I think I just got used to you handling everything, he admitted. You were so steady. I thought that meant you were fine. I was steady, I said. That doesn't mean I was fulfilled. He absorbed that quietly. I would have stepped up, he added, not pleading, just stating. I believe you, I said again. That was the strangest part. I wasn't leaving because he was incapable of growth. I was leaving because growth had only become urgent when departure did. And I needed partnership, not reaction. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling. So this is it. It wasn't a question. Yes. No tremor in my voice, no second guessing. The decision had settled weeks earlier. This conversation was simply the final articulation of something already enacted. You seem calm, he observed. I am? Doesn't this hurt? I considered that honestly. It hurt when I felt alone in the relationship. I said, this feels aligned. That silenced him. Alignment isn't dramatic. It doesn't look like triumph. It looks like stillness. We reviewed the last few details, signed paperwork, confirmed dates. At the door, he hesitated. I don't think I understood you, he said quietly. That's okay, I replied. I understand myself now. He nodded, as if accepting a truth he couldn't argue with. There was no embrace, no cinematic goodbye, just a small mutual acknowledgement of shared history. As I walked away, I didn't feel victorious. I felt precise. The confrontation had no heat because there was nothing left to ignite. I wasn't trying to convince him. He wasn't trying to overpower me. We were simply standing at the end of a pattern that had run its course. And for the first time, silence didn't feel like avoidance. It felt like closure. My apartment is quiet. Not the heavy kind of quiet that presses against your chest. The intentional kind. There are mornings when sunlight spills across the kitchen floor, and the only sound is the kettle beginning to hum. I don't reach for my phone immediately anymore. I don't check for notifications from another room. I stand there, fully present, and let the silence exist without filling it. I used to think strength meant endurance. Now I understand it also means discernment. Leaving didn't transform me into someone new. It clarified who I had always been. I'm still steady, still analytical, still calm under pressure. The difference is that I no longer offer those traits automatically at my own expense. I design my days differently now. If I have something important to say, I say it directly to colleagues, to friends, to anyone who occupies space in my life. I don't soften my needs to make them easier to digest. I don't over-explain boundaries. When someone texts me from across the table during dinner, I gently say, let's talk. And if they can't, I notice. There's no bitterness in me. That surprised me at first. I expected at least a residue of anger, but what I feel instead is clarity. He wasn't a villain. I wasn't a victim. We were two adults who drifted into a dynamic where convenience replaced connection, and only one of us felt the cost deeply enough to change it. Sometimes he still reaches out. Not frequently, just occasionally. Updates about the house refinancing. A brief congratulations when he heard through mutual friends that I completed my certification. Our exchanges are polite, calm. There's no tension and no pull. The most profound change isn't external, it's internal. I trust my perception now. When something feels off, I don't immediately rationalize it away. I don't tell myself I'm overthinking. I investigate gently. I ask questions sooner. I observe patterns without waiting for proof dramatic enough to justify action. I've also redefined partnership in my mind. It's not about grand gestures or dramatic passion. It's about shared attentiveness, mutual engagement, the willingness to pause a screen and face each other when something matters. I don't need constant intensity. I need reciprocity. My friends say I seem lighter. Maybe I am. Not because I left a relationship, but because I left a version of myself that believed being indispensable was the same as being cherished. It isn't. Indispensable people are relied upon. Cherished people are seen. Now I choose spaces where I am seen. And if I ever find myself drifting back into silence that feels like self-erasure, I won't wait years to recalibrate. I've learned that quiet dominance isn't about controlling others. It's about controlling your alignment. And alignment feels peaceful. If there's one thing this experience taught me, it's this. Disconnection rarely arrives as a disaster. It arrives as convenience, as postponed conversations, as half listening, as you're fine. Right? As texts sent from 10 steps away instead of words spoken face to face. I used to think relationships ended because of dramatic betrayals. Now I understand that some end because one person quietly carries more than they should for too long. No one shouted in my story. No one cheated. No one slammed doors. We simply drifted into a structure where my steadiness became permission for emotional minimalism. And I allowed it. That part matters. Because this isn't a story about punishing someone for not meeting my needs. It's about recognizing when I stopped meeting my own. I knew something was wrong when we started texting instead of talking in the same house. Important conversations happened through screens, even when we were in rooms 10 steps apart. And instead of confronting it fully, I adapted to it until adaptation became erosion. Leaving wasn't revenge. It was alignment. It wasn't loud. It was precise. Sometimes, quiet dominance isn't about saying more. It's about saying less and meaning it. It's about observing patterns honestly, choosing yourself without humiliating someone else, walking away without burning the ground behind you. If you're listening to this and thinking, but nothing is technically wrong in my relationship, I understand that space. I lived in it for years. The question that finally changed everything for me wasn't, is this bad enough to leave? It was, if nothing changes, is this enough to stay? That's a harder question, and a more honest one. So I'll leave you with this. Have you ever minimized your own discomfort because it didn't look dramatic enough to justify action? I'd really like to know your thoughts.
Cảm ơn bạn đã theo dõi. Hãy bấm đăng ký và bật chuông để luôn cập nhật nội dung mới. Hẹn gặp lại.